Deanne Warner disappeared on April 25th, 2021.
Usually every Saturday and Sunday, we would go over to my mom's house and have breakfast. She wasn't there. That was a huge red flag to me.
Her family is desperate for answers.
Many things were bizarre. She took her purse, she had her phone, she had her makeup bag. There was no evidence of any kind of a note.
For her to go to Mexico, go to Jamaica, no.
She got in a really bad fight with her husband. She was ready to end the marriage. She was ready to sell the businesses.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Deanne's last known steps.
She wouldn't leave us wondering what happened. She wouldn't do this to her kids. She wouldn't do this to her grandkids.
Watching the FBI, the police dig was a mix of emotions. I want my mom to be alive, but I know that my mom would never leave us.
There will be closure for the family. I guarantee it. I will not be gone until there's closure.
The more people who know Deanne's story, the greater the chance of bringing her home.
My name is Raquel Bach, and I am Dee's youngest adult daughter. It was a Saturday, and I went over to her house, and that was the last time I got to see her. My mom had a heart of gold and would do anything for anybody.
The goose in the house, staying in the starlight, and put everything down in the house for the night.
If you needed her, she would be there. But you also didn't want to get on her bad side, and you didn't want to lie to her, because she took care of business.
My name is Amy Alexander, and I have known Dee for the last 12 years. Dee was the life of the party. She radiated light. She radiated life. She texted everybody and had to know everything about everyone because she genuinely cared for people. She always went above and beyond for people. A very, very giving woman.
Her kids and her grandkids meant everything to her. I have an older sister and then 2 older brothers from my dad, and then Angelina, half-sister from my mom and her second husband, Dale.
My sister and Mr. Warner took up when they were both married. It raised a lot of eyebrows, particularly because you wouldn't match them. I mean, she had a dynamic personality that was outgoing and vivacious. He had more of an introvert personality, so they were dynamically polar opposites, not only in their personalities, but also in how they presented themselves. He'd be far from a GQ guy for sure. She was more high-maintenance, well-taken-care of woman. In fact, I don't ever remember seeing her out of the house without her makeup on. And he was the total opposite. I mean, I never seen the guy without a pair of blue jeans on, a work shirt, and a pair of work boots.
Their way of meshing was business. And I think that's what drove them together. They had the same dreams, the same goals, and they could accomplish that together. You know, they started with 1 business and then grew to 5.
My name is Mackenzie Keyline. I'm an anchor and reporter with WTVG 13 ABC. So I cover a lot of Lenawee County. That's a bit of my beat. I'm also from the area. Lenawee County is a very rural area, and Dee and Dale Warner's family is definitely a dynasty in the community, specifically when it comes to the farming side of things. They both have farming backgrounds that span generations. Dee's family, her brother Greg Hardy, has a mega dairy farm just down the road. And Dale also started his business, War Ag, and then Dee started what was a trucking business, so they were very well known. But family and friends will tell you that this was no perfect marriage. They had a rocky relationship. A lot of times they had arguments that were based on their business.
There were some very poor business decisions that were made, and she always felt like she had to fix everything. She would often talk to me about divorcing Dale or leaving Dale.
That conversation happened a lot, where she was going to leave, she was going to divorce him, she was done. When I was young, we would leave and we would go stay at a hotel. We'd stay at my uncle's for a night or 2, and then we'd go back, and everything was fine until the next fight, and we'd leave. My house is actually right behind my mom's farm. So usually every Sunday, we would go over to her house in the morning and have breakfast. So it was just a normal Sunday. I went over there with my family. She wasn't there. We walked all around the house. I couldn't find my little sister or Dale. So I assumed she was maybe with them, but she wasn't responding to my text messages, so I called her and her phone went straight to voicemail, which doesn't happen, ever. She never shuts her phone off. I knew that if she wasn't going to be there, she would have told me. So that was a huge red flag to me. Dale ended up calling me a couple hours later and asking me if I had heard from her and said, well, she's mad at me again, and she was leaving him for good. I was too shocked at the situation to even comprehend what he was really saying. I just stayed quiet. I just had a really strange feeling.
On Sunday evening, I confronted Mr. Warner face to face and said, Dale, and this is a quote, what the hell went on here? What the hell happened? He explained to me that they'd had a horrible fight the night before. She'd been very upset, and he had given her a back massage on the living room floor, and she fell asleep. He picked her up and put her on the couch about 10:30 or so, and he went to bed. And when he got up at 6:30 in the morning to go out to work at the farm, she was snoring on the couch. He said, you know, that she took off. He reaches in his left-hand pocket and pulled out her wedding ring in his left hand and bounced it up and down like a golf ball. And he said, she left this on my desk. Many things were bizarre. There was no evidence of any kind of a note or anything like that. Her car was in the garage. I said, well, Dale, she didn't walk. She never walked anywhere. She always drove her car. How do you think she left? And he said, well, somebody must have picked her up. She took her purse, she had her phone, she had her makeup bag, and her curling iron.
I called my brother and had him look at the cameras. He came to the office because at the time he worked there, and he looked through all of the cameras. So on the exterior of the house, the inside of the office, all around the buildings, just to see who was there, at what times, and what they were doing. And there was nothing with her. You couldn't find her at all. By 5 or 6 o'clock that night, my siblings all decided that it would be a good idea to contact the police, so we made our missing persons report.
My name is Troy Bevere. I'm the sheriff of Lenawee County, investigating the disappearance of Dee Warner. So our deputy responded out to the location to take a missing person report. The deputy did talk to Dale initially, and the information that Dale gave to the deputy was that she just took off. And our deputy had some concerns, and that's why the next day the detective was following up on it. What's unusual here, things were not taken that normally were car or other personal items. That really spawned us to start doing more investigation around the home.
I'm 47 years old. I've never known anybody to disappear. Never even knew somebody that disappeared. In fact, we leave our keys in our vehicles. We hardly lock our house.
So news of Dee's disappearance consumed the county. This type of thing just doesn't happen. This was the biggest news to break in this area in years. And so a lot of people had questions about what happened to Dee, where she was, and they were all wanting answers as well.
We reported her missing on a Sunday. They came on a Tuesday to do a big search at the farm. With the helicopters, the drones, the dogs, Dale initially gave consent for them to search the farm and the house. But within 2 hours, he revoked consent and told them to leave and come back with a warrant because he needed to go back to work. I just remember listening to him tell me why he did that. And all I keep thinking in my head is, your wife is missing.
We have a lot of farmers in Lenawee County, and there's a lot of farmers that when it's time to farm, it's time to farm, even if someone is missing, whether that's right or wrong. But we continued on with our investigation.
By the time they got their warrant approved and signed by a judge and got themselves gathered together, it was dark when they got back on that evening. And I know that for sure because I was actually farming in a field where I could watch them right next door. It was certainly inhibited by darkness and would not be anywhere near as good a search as they would have done in the daylight when they were there to start with. It's just frustrating, and it's horribly painful for the family.
So we just were waiting, and we kept waiting for something. There has to be something there that proves whatever happened. It felt like I got punched in the gut because it was just nothing. And I just was very confused at why Dale just didn't seem concerned.
At this point, I actually told Dale, you're the husband, you're the spouse. All eyes are going to be on you.
So that Saturday, she had texted that there was a big fight and that she was very upset with Dale. Dee was definitely the type that if something upset her, I mean, she had no problem telling anybody. She was going to send Angelina somewhere, and I said, well, let her come over and play with her cousin. So she said, okay, and I got there at 7:42, and that was the last that I ever... Her phone was off after that.
That was the day she got in a really bad fight with Dale, her husband. She was ready to end the marriage. She was ready to sell the businesses. She was ready to leave. That was the last time I got to see her.
So from the very beginning, Dale maintained that Dee left on her own accord, possibly to Mexico, Jamaica. Now, the sheriff's office says that this is a possibility, but when we talked to the family, they said this is no way that Dee would just up and leave, especially with a young child.
You start process of elimination, and the first one to get eliminated was actually someone picking her up. I contacted all of her friends. All of them were extremely surprised about what I was telling them about Dee's disappearance. We had no one that could have, quote unquote, picked up Dee, given her a ride.
So as we respond to a missing person report, you let the facts send you in the direction that you need to go in. So as you're getting that information, you want to make sure that you're asking things like, did they take a particular credit card? So that you can look at bank accounts.
There's no bank activity. You can't go MIA and not have availability to funds, to money.
My sister, respectfully, she was high maintenance, okay? So her lifestyle wasn't going to, live in the woods in some tent. So she would have had to have money, and she would have had to have a lot of it. The probability of her leaving him a wedding ring that was sizable is flat zero. That would have been an easy thing to generate cash by. We had many concerns when she went missing. Dee wasn't a person who would go hide and not say anything. She was a communicator.
The information that we really had from the family, and it made sense, was she would never not get in touch with them. It was clear after the facts started to come out that finding the truth about what happened to Dee would be a little more difficult than we had initially thought.
It wasn't unusual that she might have wanted to get away because of a fight with her husband, but it was the circumstances around how she left. No car, no daughter, no contact, no nothing. And so I was concerned about how she may have harmed herself. We had a community search that took place on the Saturday after she went missing. There were 40 or 50 people that spent hours walking the property, looking for a body because of a potential suicide. Early in the spring, there was no foliage or anything like that, so everything was pretty visible at that time. We walked the property, looked all over, and couldn't find any evidence whatsoever. And then in addition to that, and during that week, I had been speaking to experts in criminal psychology and in psychology and psychiatry, talking about how does a woman commit suicide? And it became very obvious that that wasn't a possibility.
She did not have the capability to leave Angelina, or she does not have the capability to put anybody else through this hurt. There's no way possible that she would hurt any of us this bad. She didn't have it in her. She wouldn't leave us wondering what happened. She wouldn't do this to her kids. She wouldn't do this to her grandkids.
The ghost in the house, bathed in the starlight.
So we instantly began investigating that toxic relationship between my sister and Mr. Warner.
So that Saturday, when I was there picking up Angelina, Dale pulled in. And when she saw him, she acted afraid, like she wanted to run from the door. I've seen Dee upset many times, but this was on a whole different level of being upset.
She never, ever expressed anything to me about being scared of him until the day before she went missing. By the end of our conversation, she kind of randomly just said, I watch Dateline like every night, and he could do something like that to me.
I definitely have a lot of regret not staying or not taking her with me or making sure she left the house.
For me, the most bizarre was Dale's total lack of concern, his total lack of emotion, his total demeanor about, I just want to get my life normal and go on, was, in my opinion, more impactful than sending the search party away.
When the investigation started, the lead detective pretty much spelled it out for Dale. You're the husband, you're the last person that saw her. You are going to be the person that everybody focuses on, including us.
My name is Larry Lieb. I'm an attorney here in Michigan. Maybe 2 or 3 days after Dee went missing, I got a call from Dale and I agreed to represent him. It is a bizarre situation. I don't even want to call it a case. I think it's really a situation. There's been no evidence whatsoever that connects him or anybody close to him to her disappearance.
Early on, Dee's family, they were suspicious of Dale. But those that support Dale say that there could have been other theories. So as part of our reporting, we did find that Dee had an argument with an employee just a few days before her disappearance.
I understand that Dee was a difficult person to work with, and somebody specific didn't care for her.
You're going to ruffle some feathers and you're going to step on some toes when you're in business. You can't possibly please everybody.
She got in a really bad fight with a couple employees, and she was really, really upset.
So we were shown a text message that Dee received just a few days before her disappearance. That text was sent by someone who was close with the employee that Dee got into that argument with. The text message was pretty nasty. It was rude and insulting, called her a mess, even alleging that she was taking anti-anxiety medication. So this text raised a lot of red flags, and a lot of people were wondering, did this play a role in Dee's disappearance? The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office has not made any comment about these text messages, so it definitely has a lot more questions than answers when it comes to those text messages. Dee's family thinks that she handled the business well, so the fact that she would have any sort of violence within the workplace is something that her family definitely does not think would happen.
I never really had any concern for her safety with the employees. I felt like she had a pretty strong bond with most of them. Most of her employees have worked for her for a long time. So in August of 21, Dale called my spouse, Dustin. He had something that he thought we needed to see. I, of course, was like ready for something. So we went over there and he hands me this 3-page letter in my mom's handwriting. Dale said that he found it about a week after she disappeared. And he just gave it to the sheriff's department. Why are you just now handing that over? On this letter, it talked about how much my mom loved him and how she worked so hard for him to be happy, and she just couldn't make him happy. It didn't talk about that she was leaving. And then it kind of abruptly ended with no signature, nothing. I took pictures of this letter and I sent it to my siblings. And my brother said, I know that this letter isn't recent. She wrote this letter a couple of years ago. It was very strange. And that was when I realized he's manipulating me to think that she took off on us. And I know that's not true.
So in October 2021, I was called out on breaking news that FBI agents were at the property of Dale and Dee Warner. When we arrived on scene, we saw the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office there, Michigan State Police, along with the FBI, and they had crime scene tape up around the entire area. We definitely knew something big was either happening or about to happen with the amount of authorities that were on scene.
In October, we actually had the opportunity to bring in the FBI. They had a lot of resources and a lot of agents. We brought in sonar penetrating devices so we could search the ground.
Law enforcement agencies, including the Lenawee County Sheriff's Department, Michigan State Police, and even the FBI were involved in today's search, which included looking through acres of property on the Warner's farm and excavating a nearby field.
Excavators, dogs, everything. Luminol the house. I sat on my lawn with my family, my brothers, and watched them dig in the field right next to my house. We did not get warned that that was happening. Watching them dig was a mix of emotions. I wanted an answer so bad. I wanted this to end so bad that I didn't care what it was that they found. I want my mom to be alive. But I know that my mom would never leave us.
Bevere tells us there are no new leads after today's search and no persons of interest. The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office says they are working to solve this case for her family.
We were able to rule out some things, but we were also able to get some things that I'm really not going to be able to comment on because it is an active investigation.
The emotions I was feeling was hope that there was going to be some end to this. But there wasn't. It was just another letdown.
I don't want to sound ungrateful. I'm very grateful that they did it, but it fell into that category too little, too late.
They have searched his home multiple times. They've searched his office. They've searched his warehouse. They've searched the fields. The FBI came in and dug up the fields. They used sonar to try to find any evidence they possibly can. They've downloaded all the security cameras. They've downloaded his cell phones. They've downloaded the computers. I mean, they have done everything that they could possibly do to try to find some evidence, but they haven't found anything.
So about 7 months after Dee disappeared, her family getting very frustrated with how the investigation's being handled with the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office, that's when they decided to essentially take things into their own hands, and they formed a vigil for Dee at her brother's property, Greg Hardy. And they were hoping that it would help spread the word about her disappearance and really encourage people who might know something to come forward.
I'd like to start out by saying thank you all very, very much. It's been truly amazing how many people have participated in trying to find Dee.
It was this past fall when the vigil was organized. People were at the point where they just wanted to do something, very frustrated by nothing happening.
Anything that we can possibly do to keep making people aware so that they can share. And I think Dale has done nothing to spread awareness that she's been missing. We've had vigils, and he has not come to any of them. He's had yard signs put in his yard. He's taken them down immediately. He has not spoke to any of the press.
Dale not only not participate by attending a vigil, he did not ever participate in helping organize one or organizing any kind of an event that a normal husband would do to try to help find his missing wife. So his demeanor was totally suspicious about everything.
I asked him if he had attended any of the vigils or any of that, and A, he'd never been invited by any of her family. And second of all, we're in a small town, all the fingers are pointed at him. Dale wants to believe that she's still alive and is constantly telling Angelina, Mommy's on a break and she'll come back. I think that he wants to display that sense of confidence to his daughter.
Nearly a year after Dee went missing, her family reached out to a private investigator for help, attorney Billy Little. And what makes him such a key part of this is that he has extensive experience when it comes to murder investigations, not only with his private practice, but also in the military.
We were at somewhat of a standstill, actually, with the investigation. The authorities weren't getting anywhere with the process, or they weren't getting there with any speed. The lack of transparency, the lack of accountability to the family, in my opinion, has been very frustrating, to say the least. My wife had actually seen a television program where Billy Little helped an investigation. It was impressionable enough on me. I asked my wife if she could find this guy, and I called him.
I remember the first time that I met Billy Little, I got in my car and I cried after I talked to him because I was happy. They were tears of joy and tears of, we're gonna get help. This is the man that is gonna help us. This is the man that's gonna get us answers. He is very determined. He said, just very matter-of-factly, very confidently said, I don't lose. I've got him.
Deanne Warner was last seen April 25th, 2021. If you have any information, please contact the Michigan State Police at 855-642-4847.
My name is Billy Little. I'm an investigative attorney. I've been invited by the family to help find out what happened to Dee Warner. When I come on a case, it is a fire hose of information, hundreds of hours of interviews that I've recorded, and thousands of pages of documents, and I have to sift through that. And then you start to find things, and the pieces start to come together, and you start to think, okay, here we go. Now we got something.
Like any other county, any other police agency, we have other things that we're investigating. It's a tough thing because you want to be there for the family. You want to be there for Dee, and we want to find the truth. And if a private investigator helps to get to the truth, then we welcome that because it's all for the family. It really is.
Investigating a missing person is a process of elimination. Dale started throwing out stories about, well, she had this wealthy friend who had a private jet, that she went to Mexico, that she went to Jamaica. I started looking at that, looking for this friend. If she did go to Mexico, how did she do it? Did she withdraw money out of the bank before she went? Were there any financial transactions after she left? Any credit card usage? Any phones? Any crossing of borders?
You know, she loved to travel, so Dale made the suggestion that maybe she's in Mexico or Jamaica. Sometimes people want to get away and they want to start a new life. We just don't know.
For her to go to Mexico, go to Jamaica, no. You have to have money. This is not something that you just pick up and like take off and do. You have to have a plan. Don't get me wrong, she's a smart woman, but it would take a very, very smart person just to literally drop off the face of the earth with no communication.
But there's no evidence, there's no cars missing, there's no luggage missing. One by one, things are not adding up.
So early in our reporting, we learned that Dee and Dale Warner, they were well off. They both had successful businesses. They were doing well. Dee owned that trucking company. Dale had the agriculture business. It seemed important to look into their finances and to see if that maybe played a role in Dee's disappearance.
Dee ran this very profitable trucking company. When she went missing, the assets began being bled off, stolen. Over $1 million has been taken from that business. Dale started a new business called DDW Transportation and just transferred all the assets over there. How can you possibly transfer assets when you don't own them, which is what Dale was doing? Dale produced this power of attorney that was signed back in 2014, allegedly. And the document was clearly not Dee's signature. Any layperson could have looked at it and seen that. But the document was sent to a qualified handwriting analysis examiner that came up with an expert opinion that that absolutely was not her signature on a power of attorney. Why would a person produce a forged power of attorney? Especially when you say she's coming back. If she is coming back, she sure as heck is going to know that that's a forged power of attorney.
Well, there were certainly questions about Dale's involvement in Dee's businesses, and there were other troubling factors about their relationship that were starting to come to light.
There are a lot of things about Dale's behavior that are bizarre. He had the need to know everything about her. He had the need to control her, to make her do what he wanted her to do. In order to do that, he's got to monitor what she's saying, what she's doing. So part of that was he would hide his iPad in the office in the slots where files would be kept on a desk. She would have conversations in her office, and she would say, and she would point to the recording device and then whisper to that person, "We're being recorded."
Dee had often told me that she was being recorded, that she would find iPads in odd places in the office and that the red light was on, which means, you know, that it's being recorded. It's eerily odd. There's been several times where we would be out to eat and all of a sudden Dale would show up and sit in a booth right by us. So there was no privacy. Just very odd. To say that it's coincidental would be an understatement.
Dale was showing up places that she was at, dinner, parties, and being possessive to her. In July of 2020, my mom mentioned finding something in her car. She thought it was very strange. Dustin, my spouse, said, "Go get it and show me." So she went out to her car and brought it in. She just laid it on the counter and he looked it up and it was a tracking device. My mom was going to confront him. And when she did, he said he didn't know what it was.
The idea that there was a tracker on Dee's car, I just want to address that real quickly. That tracker was only for security purposes. They have sort of suggested that Dale was somehow following her. None of that's true. That tracker was only for the purposes of if the car was stolen. So in a small town, you never know.
I don't find that this particular county is a hotbed for stolen cars, and the only tracking device was put on Dee's car, not the other cars. There are millions of dollars worth of equipment up there that don't have this tracking device. And if it was truly to find a stolen vehicle, he would have no reason to hide that from her. This is an element of control, an element of abuse, an element of stalking. He's monitoring her phone, he's recording her surreptitiously. He is very concerned about everything that she's doing until she goes missing. All of a sudden, not concerned about where she is, not trying to find her. In March of 2022, a witness gave us information. Who that witness is, I can't reveal at this point. I believe that I can prove Dale's alibi is a lie. Dale's statement that they were asleep and he left at 6 a.m. I know without any doubt that is false. On the night of April 24th, I know where he was, I know what he was doing. Dale was absolutely not at home sleeping. I received information on the Sunday when Dee disappeared that between 3 and 4:30 a.m. that morning, Dale left his home. Dale was at his father's farm at 3:55 a.m. He was seen by a witness going into the office, getting the keys for the chemical and equipment barn. When he was seen by witnesses, he was in a hurry. He didn't address anybody. He didn't look at anybody. He was completely different than he had behaved in prior times when they had seen him. In my opinion, Dale went to his father's place to try to dispose of Dee's body.
You know, the night that she went missing, Dale was wearing his Apple Watch, and it was connected to his Apple phone. And there was not a pulse that was raised. His disposition was of a normal person sleeping. Got up to go to work at 6:30 in the morning, saw his wife laying on the couch, and went to work.
Neither Dale nor his attorney have shared the Apple Watch data with us, and we have requested that, and we would be happy to look at it, happy to have some independent experts look at it. But I've turned over a great deal of information to the police.
The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office has named Deanne Warner's husband a person of interest in her disappearance.
Her family pointing a finger at Warner's husband, Dale Warner, in connection to her disappearance. However, the Lucas County Sheriff's Office has not named a suspect in the case, instead calling Dale Warner a person of interest.
The only difference between a person of interest and a suspect is a suspect, you have a crime and it's been labeled a crime. In this situation, we have a missing person. Although the longer that missing person case goes, we'll see what happens as far as developing into something else.
For me, personally, it's hard to imagine why that person wouldn't be considered a suspect.
It definitely put a divide in the county on who was on whose side. So many people went straight to thinking that Dale may have been responsible for Dee's disappearance. But at this point, Sheriff's Office really hasn't commented much about where they stand on their investigation. And we could see the frustration building with the family. But Dale and his attorneys still maintain his innocence. They say that he has cooperated with authorities, and they still say that Dee left on her own accord.
Dale really, truly believes that over the course of a period of years, she planned her exit. I think that she set herself up when he went to work to avoid the security cameras, and she left. She knew where she was going, and she knew she wanted to start fresh. And that's the reason why you haven't found any evidence whatsoever of her demise. We hope she's okay. But to this point, there's no evidence to suggest he did anything or anybody close to him did anything to assist in her disappearance.
The best case scenario, I would hope that she is somewhere like Fiji, sitting on the beach, having a drink, living life to the fullest. I would love to just be mad at her instead of mourn her. But sadly, she is also the type of person and the type of mother that could never put people through this amount of hurt and this amount of pain.
The goose in the heavens, bathe in the starlight, and
This is raw, and it's real, and it's true. I constantly wonder what happened and where she's at.
I can say that the Sheriff's Office, state police, and the FBI, we will continue to work on this until we can get closure. We're not going to give up until we have the truth.
The reality is this. There was only one person at the house on the evening that my sister disappeared. She didn't just vaporize, and that one person knows where she's at now.
Most serial killers leave behind a trail of bodies. Peter Tobin left behind something far more unsettling. He left behind questions. Questions buried beneath floorboards. Questions hidden under gardens that had long since grown green again. Questions that lingered inside police archives, gathering dust for decades while families waited for a phone call that never came. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all was this: if investigators had uncovered 3 victims by accident, how many more had simply never been found? In October 2006, detectives in Scotland believed they had solved a brutal murder. A young woman had disappeared after working inside a church. Days later, her body was discovered concealed beneath the floor of the very building where she had trusted she was safe. The suspect was a quiet maintenance worker with a long criminal history, a man whose aging face revealed little emotion when confronted with overwhelming evidence. His name was Peter Tobin. To most people, the case appeared finished. A murderer had been identified. Justice would follow. Newspapers printed the headlines. Television crews packed away their cameras. Public attention slowly drifted elsewhere. The detectives did not. Something about Tobin resisted the neat ending everyone wanted. Experienced investigators often describe a feeling they cannot immediately explain, an instinct shaped by years of studying violence. It is not supernatural. It is pattern recognition. Small inconsistencies begin connecting with one another until they form an image that refuses to disappear. Peter Tobin had lived an unusually restless life. Over 4 decades, he drifted across Britain like a shadow that never settled in one place for very long. Scotland, England, small towns, busy cities, temporary jobs, new addresses, new names, failed marriages, broken relationships. Every move seemed to erase part of his past before anyone could fully understand it. To an ordinary observer, that history looked chaotic. To homicide detectives, it looked familiar. Predatory offenders often survive by disappearing into ordinary life. They become neighbors whose names are quickly forgotten after they move away. They work jobs that require little scrutiny. They avoid attention until attention becomes impossible to escape. As investigators reconstructed Tobin's movements, another unsettling realization emerged. His timeline crossed paths with an alarming number of missing women. Sometimes the overlap was only geographic. Sometimes it was only chronological. Sometimes it was both. None of those coincidences proved murder. But there were simply too many coincidences to ignore. The murder of Angelica Cluck had cracked open a door that could no longer be closed. Detectives began asking a question few investigations ever require. What if this crime scene was not the beginning of Peter Tobin's story? What if it was the ending? That possibility transformed a single homicide investigation into one of the largest inquiries ever focused on an individual suspect in British criminal history. Its name was Operation Anagram. The title sounded almost harmless, almost administrative, as though it belonged to stacks of paperwork inside a government office. In reality, it represented thousands upon thousands of investigative hours, hundreds of officers, decades of forgotten records, and families who had spent years balancing fragile hope against unbearable uncertainty. Every old address mattered. Every previous employer mattered. Every prison record mattered. Every woman who had vanished near one of Tobin's homes suddenly mattered again. Investigators began reopening files that many believed would never again leave storage shelves. Yellowed photographs were examined under brighter lights than they had seen in years. Witness statements were read by detectives who had not even joined the police force when those interviews were first conducted. Maps were spread across conference tables as officers traced Tobin's movements across Britain year after year, searching for intersections between his life and lives that had suddenly ended without explanation. What they discovered would challenge assumptions that had remained untouched for decades. Some families received unexpected visits from detectives who quietly explained that an old investigation was being reviewed. Imagine answering your front door after 15 years, 20 years, perhaps even longer, only to hear someone say that the disappearance of your daughter had not been forgotten after all. Hope can be a cruel thing. For some parents, it returned after they had finally learned to live without it. Others feared the opposite. They feared that answers, if they ever arrived, would be far worse than uncertainty. Across Britain, journalists began asking whether Peter Tobin might be responsible for crimes reaching back into the 1970s. Television documentaries compared timelines. Crime reporters revisited forgotten disappearances. Public speculation spread rapidly, fueled by one uncomfortable reality. Nobody seemed to know where Peter Tobin had been during many periods of his life. And when investigators cannot account for a violent offender's movements, every unsolved case begins demanding another look. There were whispers of victims no one had identified. Whispers of gardens yet to be excavated. Whispers of missing women whose names had almost disappeared from public memory. Then came an even more astonishing theory. Some investigators and criminal profilers quietly considered whether Peter Tobin could be connected to one of Scotland's greatest criminal mysteries, a phantom whose identity had haunted detectives for generations. The name carried almost mythical weight. Bible John. 3 murders. Countless theories. No conviction. No confirmed identity. Could the quiet maintenance worker arrested in 2006 somehow be the same predator who had terrorized Glasgow decades earlier? The similarities were intriguing enough to demand investigation. But similarity is not proof. And in criminal investigations, assumptions can be as dangerous as ignorance. Operation Anagram would become an extraordinary exercise in patience, skepticism, and relentless detail. Detectives understood that they were walking a narrow line. Every new possibility carried the risk of creating false hope. Every coincidence demanded careful testing rather than emotional conclusions. They were not searching for stories that fit a theory. They were searching for evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom. Because in the end, no matter how frightening the suspicion, only facts could speak for the dead. The first days of Operation Anagram did not begin with dramatic discoveries or televised announcements. They began in rooms filled with silence, where detectives sat before mountains of paper that seemed almost impossible to conquer. Long before digital databases connected police forces with a few keystrokes, investigations had lived inside filing cabinets, cardboard archive boxes, handwritten notebooks, fading photographs, and cassette recordings whose labels had begun to peel with age. Every document represented someone's worst day. Every folder carried a name that a family had whispered for years without receiving an answer. The officers assigned to the operation understood that they were not simply reviewing old crimes. They were challenging conclusions that had survived for decades. Every assumption made by previous investigators would have to be questioned. Every timeline would have to be rebuilt. Every address connected to Peter Tobin would have to be placed beside every known disappearance that had occurred within reach of his movements. The work was exhausting before it was even hopeful. A map of Britain slowly became something entirely different. At first glance, it was an ordinary collection of counties, highways, coastal towns, and crowded cities. But as investigators pinned Tobin's known residences across the landscape, patterns began to emerge. Glasgow, Bathgate, Margate, Havant, Brighton, London, Aberdeen. Places where he had lived for months. Places where he had stayed only briefly. Temporary jobs. Construction work. Maintenance positions. Rental properties. Boarding houses. Homes shared with wives who would later describe lives marked by fear and control. Each location represented another chapter in a life that had never remained still. Movement, detectives knew, could mean many things. People relocate every day for work, for family, for opportunity. Constant movement alone proves nothing. Yet experienced investigators also recognized another possibility. For certain offenders, moving was not merely practical. It was protective. A fresh town meant unfamiliar neighbors. New employers asked fewer questions. Old rumors stayed behind. If suspicions ever arose, the individual could disappear before anyone connected one identity to another. The challenge facing Operation Anagram was distinguishing coincidence from criminality. That distinction would define every decision they made. As officers reconstructed Tobin's life year by year, they discovered just how difficult that task would become. Records were incomplete. Addresses conflicted. Some dates overlapped while others simply vanished into uncertainty. Witnesses remembered events differently after decades had passed. Human memory, investigators knew, was fragile. People rarely recalled ordinary Tuesdays from 20 years earlier. They remembered birthdays, funerals, weddings, and disasters. Everything else blurred into a fog where certainty became dangerous. Still, fragments accumulated. One landlord remembered a quiet tenant who kept mostly to himself. A former co-worker recalled a man who avoided personal conversations. Another witness described someone capable of switching from polite to intimidating with almost no warning. Individually, these memories carried little evidentiary value. Together, they began sketching the outline of a personality that detectives believed deserved closer examination. The more they learned about Tobin's history, the more striking one characteristic became: control. Former partners described relationships dominated by intimidation. Accounts collected over the years suggested a man who expected obedience, reacted aggressively to perceived disrespect, and concealed much of his private life even from those closest to him. None of those behaviors proved homicide. Millions of abusive individuals never become killers. But criminologists have long recognized that patterns of coercive control often appear in the backgrounds of violent offenders. Detectives could not afford to ignore that possibility. Outside police headquarters, the public's imagination began moving faster than the evidence itself. Newspaper headlines questioned whether Britain's newest convicted murderer had secretly been operating for decades. Television discussions invited retired detectives and criminal psychologists to speculate about unsolved disappearances. Every fresh article encouraged readers to compare old missing person cases against Tobin's known movements. Speculation spread quickly because uncertainty creates its own momentum. People searched maps online. Amateur investigators built timelines. Families of missing women watched every news broadcast, wondering whether this stranger's face might finally explain years of unanswered grief. For detectives leading Operation Anagram, that growing attention created another problem: pressure. Public expectations can quietly reshape investigations if officers are not careful. Every new rumor generated phone calls. Every television interview produced additional tips. Some were sincere. Others were impossible to verify. A few contradicted established facts entirely. Yet every lead required evaluation because dismissing the wrong one could mean overlooking the single detail capable of revealing another victim. The investigation expanded almost organically. Specialists in behavioral analysis examined Tobin's criminal history. Forensic experts revisited evidence collected years earlier using technologies unavailable when the original investigations had taken place. Analysts compared travel records, employment histories, prison releases, vehicle ownership, and witness statements. Slowly, an extraordinary picture emerged. Peter Tobin had crossed paths with an astonishing number of communities over 4 decades. Most people who encountered him remembered nothing unusual. That, in itself, unsettled some investigators. History has repeatedly shown that serial offenders rarely appear monstrous in everyday life. They buy groceries. They greet neighbors. They repair fences. They complain about weather. Their ordinary routines become camouflage, allowing extraordinary violence to remain hidden behind familiar faces. The image disturbed detectives because it challenged comforting assumptions about evil. There is a natural desire to believe that dangerous people announce themselves. That cruelty has an unmistakable appearance. That neighbors would somehow know. Reality is often far less reassuring. As weeks turned into months, officers revisited one discovery that had transformed everything: the excavation of the garden behind Tobin's former property in Margate. When investigators first entered the property, they were searching for answers connected to one victim. Instead, they uncovered the remains of 2 young women who had disappeared separately years earlier. The discovery fundamentally changed how police viewed Tobin. Before then, detectives were investigating a convicted murderer. Afterward, they were confronting the possibility of a serial predator whose crimes stretched across jurisdictions and decades. The implications were enormous. If 2 victims had remained hidden beneath ordinary soil for years, investigators had to consider a painful question. Were there other locations that had never been searched? The answer justified examining every place Tobin had called home. Ground-penetrating surveys were considered where appropriate. Historical property records were reviewed. Construction histories were examined to determine whether landscapes had changed since Tobin's occupancy. Officers interviewed former residents, neighbors, landlords, and contractors, searching for memories that might have seemed insignificant at the time but now demanded renewed attention. Sometimes an old memory resurfaced. A section of garden that had once appeared freshly disturbed. A tenant who had insisted on unusual privacy. An unexpected renovation. Most of these recollections ultimately led nowhere. But investigations of this scale are built upon persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Every eliminated possibility strengthened the integrity of those that remained. Meanwhile, another mystery refused to disappear. The name Bible John resurfaced with increasing frequency. For decades, the unidentified killer had occupied a unique place in Scottish criminal history. The murders attributed to him had generated countless theories, books, documentaries, and police inquiries. No definitive suspect had ever been identified. When similarities between Tobin and the long-unknown offender entered public discussion, fascination intensified almost overnight. Detectives approached the comparison with caution. They examined timelines, physical descriptions, known movements, witness accounts, behavioral characteristics. The similarities were sufficient to justify investigation. They were not sufficient to justify conclusion. That distinction mattered enormously. Operation Anagram was never intended to confirm popular theories. Its purpose was to determine what evidence could actually prove. In many ways, that philosophy separated professional investigation from public speculation. The public asks whether something is possible. Detectives ask whether it can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Those are profoundly different questions. As the inquiry continued, officers became increasingly aware that they were pursuing 2 parallel investigations. One sought additional victims. The other sought the truth about Peter Tobin himself. Those goals were connected but not identical. A man can be suspected of many crimes while legally responsible for only those supported by evidence. Investigators never forgot that principle. It guided every interview, every excavation, every reopened file, and every painstaking comparison that followed. Because somewhere within thousands of pages of forgotten reports, fading photographs, and decades-old witness statements, they hoped the truth was waiting. Whether that truth would reveal another victim or finally confirm that the known crimes were the full extent of Peter Tobin's violence remained uncertain. And uncertainty, they would soon learn, was the most relentless adversary Operation Anagram would ever face. Before a single additional body could be found, before another unanswered disappearance could be connected to Peter Tobin, investigators had to confront an uncomfortable possibility that sat at the heart of Operation Anagram. They might spend years chasing a ghost that did not exist. They might devote thousands of hours, mobilize hundreds of officers, reopen countless files, and ultimately discover that the 3 murders already attributed to Tobin were the only murders he had ever committed. It was a possibility they could not ignore. Modern criminal investigations are often remembered for dramatic breakthroughs, for DNA matches that arrive at the perfect moment or hidden confessions that suddenly unlock impossible mysteries. The reality is almost always slower. It is built on restraint. Detectives are trained to distrust instinct unless instinct can be supported by evidence. Every exciting theory must survive relentless scrutiny. Every coincidence must withstand careful examination. In cases involving suspected serial offenders, that discipline becomes even more important because fear has a way of filling the spaces where facts are missing. Operation Anagram was not created to prove Peter Tobin was Britain's most prolific unidentified killer. It was created to answer a single question. How much of the truth was still hidden? That question echoed through every office where investigators worked. It followed them home after long shifts. It lingered in conversations between officers who had spent decades investigating homicide. Some had already seen cases where the public dramatically overestimated a suspect's crimes. Others had witnessed the opposite, discovering years later that a murderer once believed responsible for only one victim had quietly claimed many more. Experience had taught them one painful lesson. The dead do not always tell their stories immediately. Sometimes they wait beneath concrete. Sometimes beneath woodland. Sometimes beneath carefully maintained gardens where flowers bloom every spring above secrets no one suspects. The discovery in Margate had permanently altered the psychology of the investigation because it shattered a dangerous assumption. Detectives had believed they understood the scale of Peter Tobin's violence. Then 2 sets of human remains emerged from ground that had been walked across for years without attracting suspicion. If chance had not directed investigators toward that property, would those victims have remained undiscovered for another decade? Another generation? Perhaps forever? No detective wanted to answer that question aloud. Instead, they returned to the files. Thousands upon thousands of pages. Missing daughters. Missing sisters. Missing girlfriends. Young women whose last known moments had been reduced to brief summaries typed years earlier by officers who could never have imagined their reports would one day become part of a national inquiry. A final bus journey. A walk home after work. A music festival. A railway station. A roadside where someone accepted a lift from a stranger. Each disappearance existed in isolation when it first occurred. Operation Anagram forced investigators to ask whether those isolated tragedies might instead belong to a single, much larger pattern. Most would not. Statistics alone made that inevitable. Britain had hundreds of unresolved disappearances spanning decades, many with explanations that remained unknown rather than criminal. Some people had chosen to leave their previous lives behind. Others had died in accidents that left little evidence. Some investigations simply reached dead ends despite every reasonable effort. Detectives understood this better than anyone. Their task was not to transform every mystery into murder. Their responsibility was to eliminate possibilities until only evidence remained. That process demanded extraordinary patience. One timeline after another was reconstructed. Where had Peter Tobin been living? What vehicle did he own? What job was he working? Who could place him in a particular town during a specific month? Had he been incarcerated? Had he been traveling? Could a witness independently verify his location? Every answer either strengthened or weakened a possible connection. Sometimes a promising lead disappeared within hours. A date proved inaccurate. An address belonged to someone else. Employment records established that Tobin had been hundreds of miles away when a woman vanished. The file would close once again. There was disappointment, but also relief. Clearing a suspect matters just as much as identifying one. It protects the integrity of every remaining conclusion. Yet some cases refused to disappear so easily. A disappearance here. A timeline there. A witness who remembered seeing a man resembling Tobin decades earlier. None of it reached the standard required for criminal prosecution. But together they created a persistent unease that investigators could never completely dismiss. Outside police headquarters, speculation continued growing. Books explored the possibility that Tobin's criminal career stretched back much further than anyone had imagined. Documentaries questioned whether Britain had unknowingly lived alongside a serial predator for generations. Internet forums filled with amateur investigators comparing photographs, maps, and historical records. Some theories bordered on the plausible. Others drifted far into imagination. Professional investigators remained careful not to confuse public fascination with factual progress. One name continued surfacing above all others. Bible John. The unidentified killer had become part of Scotland's collective memory, a symbol of unanswered violence that had resisted every attempt at identification. Linking Peter Tobin to that mystery carried enormous emotional weight because solving the Bible John murders would close one of the country's oldest criminal wounds. But emotion cannot replace evidence. Officers compared available material again and again. Physical descriptions. Estimated ages. Geographic movements. Witness testimony. Behavioral characteristics. The similarities justified examination. The differences prevented certainty. No forensic evidence established that Peter Tobin and Bible John were the same individual. No surviving witness could identify him conclusively. No courtroom would accept speculation where proof was absent. And so one of Britain's most compelling criminal theories remained exactly that. A theory. For some observers, that uncertainty felt frustrating. For investigators, it represented professional honesty. Admitting what cannot be proven is just as important as establishing what can. Months became years. Operation Anagram continued its methodical search through Britain's unresolved past, not with dramatic headlines but with quiet persistence. Detectives revisited communities where memories had faded. Families were contacted with compassion and caution. Every conversation carried the possibility of reopening grief that had never truly disappeared. Some relatives welcomed renewed investigation despite the pain. Others had learned to survive by accepting uncertainty. Hope can heal. Hope can also wound. Investigators knew they carried both possibilities every time they knocked on another front door. Eventually, the enormous inquiry reached its most difficult conclusion. Despite extensive investigation, despite years of reviewing evidence from across England and Scotland, despite examining countless disappearances and unsolved murders, there was not enough admissible evidence to prove Peter Tobin had murdered anyone beyond the three victims already established in court: Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. For some, the result sounded incomplete. For detectives, it reflected the standard upon which justice depends. Suspicion is not conviction. Probability is not proof. Questions, no matter how haunting, cannot substitute for evidence. Yet Operation Anagram achieved something profoundly important. It demonstrated that forgotten victims still matter. That decades-old cases deserve renewed attention when new evidence emerges. That investigators have an obligation to pursue uncomfortable possibilities, even when those possibilities ultimately remain unresolved. Most importantly, it reminded Britain that behind every cold case is a family whose calendar stopped on the day someone failed to come home. Some received answers. Many did not. Peter Tobin died in prison in 2022, carrying with him whatever truths remained locked inside his own memory. Whether he was responsible for additional crimes beyond those proven in court may never be known with certainty. The unanswered questions that surrounded his life did not disappear with his death. They simply became quieter, settling once more into police archives, unsolved case files, and the memories of families still waiting for certainty that may never arrive. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of Operation Anagram. Not that it uncovered every answer, but that it proved how easily the past can hide its darkest secrets in plain sight, waiting for one discovery to make an entire nation wonder how much still remains buried beneath the surface. The story of Operation Anagram did not begin inside a police headquarters, nor did it begin with flashing blue lights outside a crime scene. It began years earlier, scattered across towns and cities that, on the surface, had nothing to do with one another. Busy railway stations, quiet suburban streets, aging churches, modest rental homes, and neighborhoods where people knew each other well enough to exchange greetings but not well enough to recognize the private lives unfolding behind closed doors. It was a Britain undergoing steady change, yet beneath that ordinary rhythm lay a reality familiar to every police force. Most violent offenders were not strangers to the criminal justice system. They accumulated histories of assault, theft, sexual violence, or domestic abuse long before their names became known nationally. Peter Tobin's life fit that broader pattern in important ways. Born in Scotland in 1946, he spent decades moving between Scotland and England, living in numerous towns and cities over the course of his adult life. Public records and later investigations showed that he frequently changed addresses and, at times, used different identities. He worked a variety of jobs that brought him into different communities, often for relatively short periods. Individually, none of these facts suggested involvement in homicide. Many people relocate repeatedly throughout their lives. Many change careers. Many disappear from one neighborhood only to begin again in another. It was only after Tobin's conviction for murder that investigators looked back across those years and recognized how difficult it was to reconstruct his movements with confidence. The Britain through which Tobin moved was itself changing. During the late 20th century, policing was far less interconnected than it is today. Information was often stored locally, investigations were conducted within regional jurisdictions, and communication between forces depended heavily on manual record-keeping and direct contact. National databases existed but were far less comprehensive than modern systems. A violent offender who crossed county or national boundaries within the United Kingdom could, in some circumstances, leave behind fragmented records spread across multiple police forces. Detectives working one investigation might never realize that another force held information which, if viewed together, could reveal a larger pattern. This was not negligence. It reflected the technological limitations of the period. Communities themselves were changing as well. Rail travel connected cities more efficiently, temporary employment became increasingly common in certain industries, and people relocated for work with greater frequency. Construction sites, maintenance contracts, seasonal labor, and short-term accommodation created environments where newcomers attracted little attention. A man could arrive in a town, rent a room, find employment, remain for months or years, and leave with relatively few people knowing much about him beyond his first name and occupation. Investigators later recognized that such mobility complicated efforts to reconstruct Tobin's life. Each move required fresh searches through electoral registers, employment records, tenancy agreements, prison documentation, witness interviews, and archived police files. The challenge was not simply determining where he had lived, but establishing precisely when he had been there. Even small errors in dates could dramatically alter the relevance of a potential investigative lead. By the early 2000s, Peter Tobin was living in Glasgow and working as a handyman and maintenance worker. Those who encountered him in professional settings generally saw an older man capable of carrying out practical work around buildings. On the surface, there was little to distinguish him from countless others employed in similar roles. Yet beneath that outward appearance was a substantial criminal history. Long before the murder case that would make international headlines, Tobin had accumulated convictions for serious violent and sexual offenses. His record demonstrated a pattern of criminal conduct extending across many years, including offenses involving violence against women and girls. Those convictions would later become a significant part of investigators' assessment when considering whether his known crimes represented isolated acts or part of a broader history of offending. Even so, criminal history alone cannot establish responsibility for unsolved murders. Detectives involved in Operation Anagram repeatedly emphasized the importance of separating suspicion from evidence. An individual may possess a lengthy record of violent crime without being connected to every unsolved case that occurs nearby. Maintaining that distinction was essential to preserving the integrity of the investigation. The confirmed victims whose cases ultimately became linked to Tobin came from different backgrounds and different moments in time. Their lives did not intersect with one another, and their disappearances initially belonged to separate investigations handled years apart. Only much later would detectives recognize that a single offender had been present in all three cases proven before the courts. This separation illustrates one of the greatest challenges in homicide investigation. Crimes committed years apart, in different jurisdictions and under different circumstances, often appear unrelated until new evidence creates a connection. Before that point, each investigation naturally focuses on the victim's immediate surroundings, family, friends, colleagues, and local suspects. Detectives cannot pursue links they do not yet know exist. When investigators later reconstructed Tobin's history, they found themselves examining not only his criminal record but also the ordinary details of daily life. They reviewed employment histories, vehicle ownership, prison release dates, residential addresses, and documented travel. These records allowed them to build an increasingly detailed timeline, identifying where Tobin could be placed with confidence and where uncertainty remained. The resulting chronology became one of the central tools of Operation Anagram, helping investigators compare his known movements against unresolved disappearances spanning several decades. The investigation also highlighted how advances in forensic science had transformed criminal inquiries. Evidence collected years earlier could sometimes be re-examined using techniques unavailable at the time of the original investigation. Improvements in DNA analysis, digital record management, and forensic archaeology provided opportunities to revisit cases that had once reached investigative dead ends. Operation Anagram therefore represented not only a review of Peter Tobin's past but also a demonstration of how evolving investigative methods could breathe new life into long-standing cases. Public interest in the inquiry grew steadily as details emerged. Media coverage often focused on the possibility that Tobin might have been responsible for additional crimes beyond those already proven in court. Detectives, however, adopted a more measured approach. Their objective was neither to confirm nor to dismiss speculation prematurely. Instead, they sought to establish what could be supported by reliable evidence. This distinction shaped every stage of the inquiry and remains one of its defining characteristics. Against this backdrop, Operation Anagram began to take shape not as a search driven by headlines, but as a systematic effort to reconstruct decades of history with precision. Every confirmed address, every documented movement, every surviving witness statement, and every preserved case file became part of an increasingly complex picture. Whether that picture would ultimately reveal additional victims remained uncertain. What was certain was that investigators were now looking at Peter Tobin's life not as a series of isolated events, but as a timeline whose significance could only be understood by examining it in its entirety. Throughout the investigation, detectives repeatedly returned to a principle that has guided major homicide inquiries for decades: understanding an offender requires understanding the world in which that offender operated. Peter Tobin's movements could not be viewed in isolation. They had to be placed within the social, technological, and policing environment of Britain during the final decades of the 20th century. Between the 1970s and the early 2000s, police investigations were often constrained by the practical realities of the era. Information sharing between forces was improving, but it was still far from seamless. Individual police services maintained their own records, investigative priorities naturally focused on local crimes, and computer systems evolved gradually rather than all at once. When an offender moved repeatedly between jurisdictions, reconstructing that person's history years later could become an enormous undertaking. Detectives involved in Operation Anagram therefore spent considerable time reconciling records from different regions, confirming dates, and eliminating inconsistencies before drawing any conclusions. This painstaking work reflected the standards expected in a major criminal inquiry. Every confirmed address associated with Tobin had to be supported by documentation wherever possible. Electoral records, tenancy information, prison records, employment histories, and witness interviews all contributed pieces to the larger chronology. The resulting timeline was not simply an administrative exercise. It allowed investigators to determine where Tobin could reliably be placed at particular moments and, equally importantly, where he could not. That distinction mattered because speculation had begun to outpace evidence. As media coverage expanded, questions emerged about whether Tobin might be connected to numerous unresolved disappearances across Britain. Some similarities appeared noteworthy. Certain missing persons had disappeared while Tobin was known to be living nearby. Others vanished during periods when his documented whereabouts remained less certain. Yet proximity alone does not establish criminal responsibility. Detectives therefore approached every potential connection with the same disciplined methodology: first establish the timeline, then examine available evidence, and only afterwards consider whether further investigation was justified. The inquiry also highlighted the complexity of long-term investigations involving historical cases. Witnesses who had spoken to police decades earlier were sometimes interviewed again, not because their original statements were considered inadequate, but because new information occasionally changed the significance of details that had once seemed unimportant. Human memory, however, changes over time. Investigators remained cautious when evaluating recollections offered many years after the events themselves. Wherever possible, memories were compared against contemporaneous records rather than accepted in isolation. Forensic science also played a significant role in shaping the investigation. Advances in DNA profiling and forensic archaeology had transformed the way historical cases could be examined. Material collected years earlier could sometimes be re-evaluated using methods unavailable during the original investigation. In addition, improvements in forensic excavation techniques informed the careful examination of locations associated with Tobin when investigators believed there were reasonable grounds to conduct searches. These developments reflected broader changes within criminal investigation rather than innovations unique to Operation Anagram, but they nevertheless expanded the range of evidence that could be considered. As detectives reconstructed Tobin's documented history, they also reviewed his known criminal record. Prior convictions demonstrated a pattern of serious violent and sexual offending extending over many years. Those convictions were directly relevant because they established behaviors already proven before the courts. At the same time, investigators remained mindful that previous convictions, however serious, could not substitute for evidence in unrelated cases. The inquiry therefore distinguished carefully between confirmed criminal conduct and unproven allegations. Media attention intensified whenever Operation Anagram became publicly visible. Newspapers, television programs, and later documentary productions frequently examined the possibility that Tobin had committed additional murders. Among the most widely discussed questions was whether he might have been connected to the unidentified offender known as Bible John, whose murders in Glasgow during the late 1960s remain one of Scotland's most enduring unsolved cases. Detectives reviewed that possibility alongside other investigative leads. They compared timelines, available descriptions, and relevant evidence, but no conclusive forensic or testimonial evidence established that Tobin and Bible John were the same individual. Consequently, no such conclusion was reached by investigators. The operation therefore occupied an unusual position within British criminal history. It was both retrospective and forward-looking. Detectives examined events stretching back decades while applying modern investigative methods to determine whether additional crimes could be identified. Every lead required balancing openness to new possibilities with adherence to evidentiary standards. In practice, this meant that many potential links were examined and ultimately excluded because the available evidence did not support them. Operation Anagram also underscored the importance of collaboration between police forces. Cases originating in different regions required coordination across jurisdictions, reflecting the reality that serious offenders do not necessarily remain within the administrative boundaries of a single police service. Information that appeared routine in one investigation could assume greater significance when viewed alongside records from another. Bringing those materials together demanded extensive coordination among investigators, analysts, forensic specialists, and support staff over an extended period. By the time the inquiry was fully underway, investigators had assembled one of the most comprehensive reconstructions of Peter Tobin's documented movements ever undertaken. The resulting body of work served two purposes. It assisted in evaluating unresolved disappearances that warranted renewed attention, and it provided a factual foundation against which speculation could be tested. Some theories became stronger after comparison with the evidence. Others weakened or were eliminated altogether. In each instance, the objective remained the same: to determine what the evidence could genuinely support, rather than what public interest or intuition might suggest. This methodical approach defined Operation Anagram from beginning to end. Rather than pursuing dramatic conclusions, investigators concentrated on assembling verified facts, recognizing that major criminal inquiries are built not on isolated discoveries but on the cumulative weight of carefully tested evidence. It was within that disciplined framework that the investigation continued, gradually revealing the confirmed history of one convicted murderer while confronting the enduring uncertainties that surrounded the possibility of others. As Operation Anagram continued, investigators were forced to confront one of the most difficult aspects of examining a suspected serial offender: the difference between a pattern and a coincidence. The human mind naturally searches for connections. When a person is linked to one horrific crime, people instinctively begin looking backward, searching through every unexplained event that occurred around that individual. It is a powerful instinct, and sometimes it leads to discoveries that would otherwise remain hidden. But it can also create assumptions that evidence cannot support. For the detectives working on Operation Anagram, this balance became central to everything they did. Peter Tobin had already been proven responsible for 3 murders. That fact alone placed him among Scotland's most notorious criminals. But the possibility that he may have been responsible for more victims carried enormous consequences. Every potential connection had to be treated with seriousness, yet every accusation had to meet the same legal standard required in any criminal investigation. The victims were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people whose lives had existed long before their names appeared in police files. This understanding shaped the way investigators approached unresolved cases. They were not simply looking for evidence against Tobin. They were revisiting the stories of people who had disappeared and whose families had spent years living without answers. A missing person report represented more than an administrative record. Behind every report was a person who had been loved, someone whose absence had changed the lives of parents, siblings, partners, and friends. That perspective influenced the atmosphere surrounding Operation Anagram. The investigation was not only about examining the past of a convicted murderer. It was also about acknowledging the unfinished stories of those who had vanished. Among the many questions investigators examined was whether Tobin's behavior had followed a recognizable pattern. Criminal psychologists and investigators studying serial offenders often look for consistency in methods, victim selection, geographical behavior, and periods of activity. However, real criminal behavior rarely follows a perfect pattern. Offenders adapt. Circumstances change. Opportunities appear and disappear. The absence of an obvious pattern does not eliminate the possibility of a connection, but the presence of similarities alone cannot prove one. In Tobin's case, investigators examined whether his known movements corresponded with unresolved cases involving young women. They considered locations where he had lived, worked, or spent significant periods of time. They reviewed reports from different police forces and looked for information that had previously existed separately but might become significant when viewed together. The sheer volume of information made the process challenging. A single missing person investigation may contain hundreds of documents. When multiplied across decades and multiple regions, the scale becomes enormous. Each file had to be reviewed carefully. Names had to be checked against addresses. Dates had to be compared. Witness accounts had to be evaluated. Investigators needed to determine whether a possible connection was supported by evidence or simply created by timing and geography. Many potential links were eliminated. A person who appeared to be connected through location might have been elsewhere at the relevant time. A similarity between cases might disappear after examining the details. A witness memory might prove unreliable when compared against official records. This process was not a failure. In major investigations, elimination is progress. Removing unsupported theories allows investigators to focus resources where evidence is strongest. One of the most publicly discussed theories surrounding Tobin was the possibility that he could have been connected to the unsolved Bible John murders. The case had haunted Scotland for decades. During the late 1960s, 3 women were murdered in Glasgow after visiting the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular dance venue. The unidentified suspect became known as Bible John because witnesses reported that he had made references to religious themes during conversations. Despite extensive police efforts over many years, the identity of the offender was never conclusively established. When Peter Tobin's name later entered public discussion, comparisons emerged because he had lived in Glasgow during the relevant period. Some observers believed there were similarities worth examining. Investigators therefore reviewed the possibility as part of their wider assessment. However, the passage of time created significant challenges. Decades had passed. Memories had faded. Available evidence was limited. And crucially, no forensic evidence connected Tobin to those murders. The investigation demonstrated an important reality of cold case work. Even compelling theories require proof. A suspect may fit aspects of a description or share certain characteristics with an unknown offender, but criminal cases cannot be built on resemblance alone. The Bible John theory remained unresolved. It became one of many unanswered questions associated with Peter Tobin's name, but it never became an established fact. As the years passed, Operation Anagram continued to examine information from across Britain. The inquiry became a reminder that solving crime is rarely a straight path from discovery to conclusion. Instead, it is a process of assembling fragments, testing possibilities, and accepting uncertainty when evidence reaches its limit. For the families connected to unsolved disappearances, the investigation carried complicated emotions. Renewed attention could bring hope that answers might finally emerge. At the same time, it could reopen painful memories that had never fully healed. Many families had spent years adapting to uncertainty, creating lives around an absence that could not be explained. The possibility of answers was both a comfort and a source of fear. Because sometimes the truth provides closure. And sometimes the truth confirms the tragedy that families had always feared. Investigators understood this deeply. Contacting relatives was not simply part of gathering information. It required sensitivity, patience, and recognition that every conversation involved real human loss. This human element remained present throughout Operation Anagram. Behind the legal questions and investigative procedures was a much larger story about memory, justice, and time. Time had helped conceal Peter Tobin's actions. But time also preserved evidence. Old records remained. Photographs survived. Witnesses remembered. Advances in forensic science created opportunities that investigators decades earlier could never have imagined. The past was no longer completely unreachable. Yet even with all those advantages, one reality remained unavoidable: evidence determines what can be proven. Operation Anagram uncovered significant information about Peter Tobin's life and confirmed the identities of 3 victims whose cases had once been unresolved. It revealed failures of opportunity, gaps in understanding, and the difficulty of recognizing a dangerous offender before the full extent of his actions becomes visible. But it also demonstrated the limits of investigation. A suspicion can be powerful. A theory can be convincing. A pattern can appear undeniable. But justice requires something more. It requires evidence strong enough to transform uncertainty into fact. And as Operation Anagram moved toward its final conclusions, investigators had to accept that some questions surrounding Peter Tobin might never receive definitive answers. The investigation had reached further back into his life than anyone had expected, but there remained a boundary between what was suspected and what could be proven. Beyond that boundary was a landscape of unanswered questions. A place where families continued waiting. A place where history remained incomplete. Before Peter Tobin became a name associated with investigations, courtrooms, and unanswered questions, the women whose lives were taken were simply people living ordinary days. They had families. They had plans. They had memories that existed long before their names appeared in police reports. In many true crime investigations, the attention naturally moves toward the offender. The investigation, the evidence, the courtroom, and the mystery surrounding the person accused of terrible acts often dominate the story. But behind every case file is a human life that existed independently of the crime committed against them. Operation Anagram was ultimately an investigation into Peter Tobin's movements and possible crimes, but at its heart were the stories of those who disappeared and the families who waited years for answers. Among the confirmed victims connected to Tobin were 3 women whose lives ended in different places and different circumstances: Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. Their stories began not with tragedy, but with ordinary hopes and everyday experiences. This is where their stories deserve to begin. With who they were. Not how they died. Angelica Cluck was 23 years old when her life came to an abrupt end in Glasgow in 2006. She was originally from Poland and had moved to Scotland seeking opportunities and a different future. Like many people who leave their home country, Angelica carried with her the challenge of adapting to a new environment. A different language. Different customs. Different surroundings. Yet those challenges did not define her. People who knew Angelica remembered a young woman who was building a life for herself. She was studying, working, and trying to create stability in a country far from where she had grown up. She represented a generation of young Europeans who crossed borders in search of education, employment, and new experiences. In Glasgow, she worked at St. Patrick's Church in Anderston, helping with cleaning duties and other tasks. The church was not just a workplace. It was part of the environment where she spent her days, a place connected with routine and familiarity. There was nothing about that ordinary setting that suggested danger. A church, by its very nature, represents safety for many people. It is a place where individuals expect compassion, trust, and protection. The idea that violence could occur there created a sense of shock far beyond the immediate investigation. For those who knew Angelica, the tragedy was not simply the loss of a young woman. It was the loss of a future. A future that included possibilities she would never experience. A future that her family would never see unfold. When Angelica disappeared in September 2006, the initial concern was focused on finding her. At that stage, there was still hope. Missing person investigations always carry that fragile possibility that the person will return. Families hold on to small signs, waiting for a phone call, a message, a piece of information that changes everything. But as days passed, the uncertainty grew heavier. The investigation that followed would eventually expose a crime that shocked Scotland and led detectives toward Peter Tobin. Yet even after the arrest, even after the courtroom proceedings, the central truth remained unchanged. A young woman who had traveled to Scotland looking for a better life was gone. Her family had lost someone irreplaceable. Years before Angelica Cluck's death, 2 teenagers disappeared in cases that remained unsolved for more than a decade. The first was Vicky Hamilton. Vicky was 15 years old when she vanished in 1991. At 15, life is often defined by beginnings. Friendships become more important. Independence begins to grow. The future feels distant but full of possibilities. For many teenagers, the world is gradually expanding beyond childhood, bringing new experiences and new responsibilities. Vicky was a young girl at that point in her life. She had a family. She had people who cared about her. She had a future that should have continued. On February 10, 1991, Vicky was seen waiting at a bus stop in Bathgate, West Lothian. It was an ordinary moment, The kind of moment that happens thousands of times every day. A teenager waiting for transportation. A person moving through a familiar routine. Then she disappeared. At first, her disappearance was a mystery without answers. Her family waited. Searches were conducted. Information was collected. But time passed without resolution. For years, the unanswered question remained the same. What happened to Vicky? Her disappearance became one of many missing person cases that remained open, a file waiting for the discovery of new information. Behind the official language of police records was a much more painful reality. A family living with uncertainty. Birthdays passing without celebration. Holidays marked by absence. Years accumulating without explanation. The disappearance of a loved one creates a unique form of grief. There is no clear ending. No moment when a family can fully understand what happened. Instead, there is a constant state of waiting, where hope and fear exist together. For more than 16 years, that was the reality faced by Vicky's family. They did not know where she was. They did not know what had happened. They could only continue searching for answers. Dinah McNichol was 18 years old when she disappeared in 1991. Like Vicky, she was young, with an entire life ahead of her. Dinah disappeared after attending the A-Level Music Festival in Liphook, Hampshire, in August 1991. She had been enjoying an event that represented youth, freedom, and the experiences that often define early adulthood. Music festivals are usually remembered as places of excitement. Friends gathering together. New memories being created. People experiencing a temporary escape from everyday life. For Dinah, however, that journey became the last known chapter of her life. After the festival, she vanished. Her family was left with questions that had no answers. Where had she gone? Who had she met? Could something have been done differently? These are questions many families of missing people carry for years, even when they understand intellectually that they are not responsible. The human mind naturally searches for explanations after tragedy. It looks backward, examining every decision, every conversation, every moment before the disappearance. For Dinah's family, time did not erase the loss. It simply changed the way they carried it. The world continued moving forward. People around them grew older. Technology changed. New generations arrived. But somewhere, frozen in 1991, was the unanswered mystery of an 18-year-old who never returned home. The connections between Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah were not immediately obvious. They lived in different places. They disappeared in different years. Their families had no reason to believe their stories were connected. That is one of the most painful realities of long-term criminal investigations. Sometimes the truth exists, but the connections remain invisible. A victim's disappearance may be investigated as a single event because investigators only have the information available at that moment. Without evidence linking separate cases, every disappearance must be treated individually. For Vicky and Dinah, the answers would not come quickly. For Angelica, the truth would emerge much faster, but at a devastating cost. Their stories eventually became connected through the investigation into Peter Tobin, but they were never defined by him. They were defined by the lives they lived before his name entered their stories. Angelica was more than a victim found inside a church. Vicky was more than a missing teenager whose case remained unresolved. Dinah was more than a name in a decades-old investigation. They were daughters, friends, and individuals whose futures mattered. And as Operation Anagram expanded, detectives were not simply searching for evidence against one man. They were searching for answers for the people who had been waiting the longest. For families who had spent years wondering. For memories that deserved to be recovered. For lives that deserved to be remembered. For the families of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, the passage of time did not bring closure. It brought a different kind of existence, one shaped by uncertainty. When a person dies, grief follows a painful but recognizable path. There is a moment of loss, a moment when reality becomes undeniable. There are funerals, memories shared, photographs displayed, and eventually a process of learning how to live with absence. But when someone disappears, grief becomes something more complicated. There is no final goodbye. No certainty. No place to direct the pain. Families of missing people often live between two impossible realities. One part of them understands that something terrible may have happened. Another part continues waiting for the possibility that the person they love might somehow return. A phone call. A knock at the door. A stranger with information. A piece of evidence discovered after years of silence. That uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. For Vicky Hamilton's family, the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl created a wound that remained open for more than a decade. Every year that passed carried the same unanswered question. What had happened on that day in February 1991? Vicky had been a teenager at the beginning of her life, an age where the future still seemed endless. 15 years old is an age of transition. A person is no longer a child, yet still has so many experiences ahead. Friendships, education, adulthood, relationships, and dreams are all still forming. Those possibilities were suddenly interrupted. The investigation into her disappearance continued, but like many missing person cases, it faced the difficult reality of limited information. There was no confirmed explanation, no clear path forward, and no immediate evidence that could reveal what had happened. Years passed. The world changed around the family. Technology advanced. New methods of investigation developed. But the unanswered questions remained. For families waiting for information, time has a strange quality. The calendar continues moving, but emotionally, part of life remains fixed at the moment of disappearance. Important occasions become reminders of absence. Birthdays become difficult milestones. Anniversaries mark not only the passing of another year, but another year without answers. The same painful uncertainty surrounded Dinah McNichol's disappearance. At 18 years old, Dinah was entering adulthood. She had experienced the excitement and independence that comes with youth. Attending a music festival represented a moment of freedom, a chance to spend time with others and create memories. Instead, it became the final known chapter of her life. For her family, the years afterward were defined by questions that could not be answered. Investigators continued searching. Information was reviewed. Possible leads were examined. But the case remained unresolved. Every missing person investigation carries its own difficulties, but cases involving young people often create a particularly powerful public response. People imagine the fear surrounding the final moments. They imagine the families waiting at home. They imagine the ordinary plans that were never completed. Yet behind the public attention are private moments that few people ever see. Families opening old photographs. Families remembering voices that have not been heard for years. Families keeping belongings exactly as they were because changing anything feels like accepting a reality they are not ready to face. The passage of time can create a painful contradiction. The world expects people to move forward. But some losses cannot simply be left behind. When Peter Tobin was arrested in connection with the murder of Angelica Cluck in 2006, investigators began examining his background. At first, the focus was on the immediate crime. But as detectives uncovered more about his history, the possibility emerged that he might be connected to older cases. For the families of Vicky and Dinah, this development brought a mixture of emotions. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a possibility that answers might come. But those answers carried a devastating implication. Finding the truth meant accepting that their loved ones were no longer missing. They were victims of murder. For many families, this moment represents one of the most difficult stages of a long investigation. The search for a missing person is often driven by hope. Even when the possibility seems unlikely, hope can survive for years. A confirmed death brings certainty, but certainty can be painful. The discovery of Vicky and Dinah's remains in 2007, after investigators searched a property connected to Tobin, finally provided answers. The news transformed 2 decades of uncertainty into a confirmed tragedy. For investigators, it represented a major breakthrough. For the families, It was something far more complicated. The questions that had haunted them for years were finally answered. But the answers were heartbreaking. No investigation can return the years lost. No courtroom decision can restore the future that was taken. Justice can recognize wrongdoing. It can establish responsibility. But it cannot reverse time. The story of Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah also highlights a broader truth about criminal investigations. Victims must remain at the center of the story. When cases become associated with notorious offenders, there is a risk that the offender's name becomes larger than the lives they destroyed. Headlines repeat the suspect's name. Documentaries examine their behavior. Public curiosity focuses on their background and psychology. But the victims existed before the crime. They had personalities. They had relationships. They had ordinary moments that mattered. Angelica had built a new life away from her birthplace. Vicky was a teenager whose future had only begun. Dinah was a young woman experiencing the independence of early adulthood. Their lives cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. This understanding influenced the way Operation Anagram was viewed by many investigators. The purpose was not simply to understand Peter Tobin. It was to provide answers to people who had spent years living with uncertainty. Every file reviewed represented someone's missing person report. Every address examined represented a possible location connected to someone's final days. Every interview represented an attempt to recover pieces of a story that had remained incomplete. The discovery of the truth about Vicky and Dinah also changed the perception of Peter Tobin's crimes. Before those discoveries, the murder of Angelica Cluck appeared to be an isolated case involving a dangerous individual. Afterward, investigators were forced to reconsider the scale of his offending. A man who had already been convicted of serious crimes was now connected to murders committed 15 years earlier. The timeline had expanded. The investigation had expanded. And the questions had multiplied. If Tobin had been responsible for crimes in 1991, investigators had to ask whether other years in his history required examination. Other places. Other disappearances. Other families still waiting. This was the moment when the investigation moved beyond a single homicide case and became something much larger. Operation Anagram was no longer only about proving what had happened. It was about determining how much of Peter Tobin's history remained hidden. And as detectives began looking deeper into the decades before Angelica Cluck's murder, they entered a world of unanswered questions, forgotten files, and unresolved disappearances. A world where every timeline mattered. Every location mattered. And every victim deserved to be remembered. When Operation Anagram expanded, investigators were not only examining the actions of Peter Tobin. They were also confronting the uncomfortable reality that many missing person cases fade from public attention long before they are resolved. A headline appears. A search begins. A community looks for answers. Then, as weeks become months and months become years, the attention slowly decreases. The photographs that once appeared on television screens are no longer seen as often. The names that once dominated news reports become known mainly to the families who continue waiting. For detectives reviewing decades of unresolved cases, one of the most important tasks was restoring those names to the center of the investigation. Because behind every unresolved file was a person. Someone who had once walked through a town, entered a workplace, sat at a kitchen table, laughed with friends, and imagined a future that would never arrive. The work of Operation Anagram required investigators to look beyond the confirmed victims and examine the possibility that other people might have crossed paths with Tobin during periods when his movements remained uncertain. This process was complex. A person's life leaves behind thousands of small traces. Addresses. Employment records. Relationships. Travel. Financial information. Conversations remembered by others. When investigators attempt to reconstruct decades of history, they are essentially rebuilding a life piece by piece. But a reconstructed timeline is only meaningful when compared against reliable evidence. A person being present in the same town as a disappearance does not prove involvement. A similar age or appearance does not prove involvement. A troubling background does not prove involvement. These principles were particularly important in an investigation surrounded by public fear and speculation. Once a convicted murderer becomes linked to a larger number of possible crimes, there is a natural desire to find explanations for every unanswered mystery. But investigators understood that every unsolved case represented a real person and a real family. Turning uncertainty into accusation without evidence could create another injustice. The challenge was to search widely while concluding carefully. The confirmed cases of Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol demonstrated how easily connections between crimes can remain hidden for years. Vicky disappeared in 1991. Dinah disappeared later that same year. Angelica was murdered in 2006. At the time, nobody investigating those individual cases could have known they would eventually become connected through one offender. That reality changed the way detectives viewed historical investigations. A case that appears isolated may not remain isolated forever. New evidence can change the meaning of old information. A detail that once seemed insignificant can become important when viewed from a different perspective. This is one of the reasons cold case investigations require patience. Investigators are not simply searching for new evidence. Sometimes they are searching for a new way to understand evidence that already exists. As detectives reviewed Tobin's history, they examined the many different environments in which he had lived. The communities themselves varied greatly. Some were urban areas where thousands of people passed through streets every day. Others were smaller communities where neighbors were more likely to notice unfamiliar faces. Some locations were temporary stops in Tobin's life. Others represented longer periods where he established routines. Each place created a different investigative challenge. In a large city, anonymity can make it easier for individuals to disappear into ordinary life. In a smaller community, people may remember unusual behavior but struggle to connect it to a crime years later. Time changes everything. Buildings are renovated. Businesses close. People move away. Memories become less certain. Yet investigators continued searching because even small details can sometimes become significant. A conversation remembered by a former neighbor. A record stored in an archive. A document that survived decades of administrative changes. A name appearing in an unexpected location. The process was slow, but that was the nature of the investigation. Operation Anagram was not built around a single dramatic discovery. It was built around thousands of small pieces of information examined together. One of the most difficult aspects of studying possible serial offenders is understanding the difference between known victims and suspected victims. In the cases proven against Peter Tobin, investigators had evidence strong enough to satisfy the criminal justice system. They had identifiable victims. They had forensic evidence. They had circumstances that could be presented in court. Beyond those cases, the situation was different. There were questions. There were possibilities. There were cases that appeared worthy of examination. But questions are not conclusions. A responsible investigation must be willing to say, "This remains unknown." That phrase can be difficult for families to hear. It can also be difficult for the public to accept. People want complete answers. They want every mystery solved, every missing person located, every offender fully exposed. But real investigations do not always provide that ending. Sometimes the evidence reaches a boundary. Sometimes the truth exists beyond what can be proven. The investigation into Peter Tobin also raised broader questions about how society recognizes dangerous individuals. Looking back, it can seem obvious that warning signs existed. His criminal history. His violence. His behavior toward others. But hindsight has a way of creating clarity that was unavailable at the time. People rarely see the complete picture while events are unfolding. A neighbor sees a neighbor. A coworker sees a coworker. A landlord sees a tenant. Each person sees only a small part of a much larger story. Investigators involved in Operation Anagram were not searching for someone who looked like a stereotypical criminal. They were examining the reality that offenders can exist within ordinary environments. They can maintain routines. They can interact with communities. They can leave behind memories that seem unremarkable until later events give them new meaning. This was one of the most unsettling aspects of the Tobin investigation. The possibility that an individual could move through different communities for decades while leaving behind only fragments of suspicion. As Operation Anagram continued, the identities of confirmed victims remained the foundation of the investigation. Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, Dinah McNichol. 3 names. 3 lives. 3 families forever changed. Their cases demonstrated both the power and limitations of criminal investigation. The truth eventually emerged. But it emerged slowly. Years after Vicky and Dinah disappeared. Days after Angelica was murdered. After families had already endured unimaginable waiting. Their stories became part of a much larger investigation, but they were never merely evidence. They were the reason the investigation mattered. The legacy of Operation Anagram is not only found in police files or courtroom records. It exists in the reminder that unresolved cases are not forgotten simply because time passes. A missing person does not become less important because years go by. A family's grief does not expire. A question does not disappear because an answer takes decades to find. For the investigators who worked through thousands of pages and countless possibilities, the mission remained focused on one central idea. Every person deserves to know what happened to the people they love. And every victim deserves to be remembered as more than the crime that ended their life. Before Peter Tobin became the subject of one of Britain's largest criminal investigations, Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah were individuals with their own stories. Operation Anagram revealed the circumstances that connected their deaths. But their lives existed long before the investigation began. And that is where their stories truly belong. 4 years, the lives of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol remained separated by distance, circumstance, and unanswered questions. Their disappearances belonged to different police files, handled by different investigators, in different parts of Britain. There was no obvious connection that could unite them. Then, in 2006, a new case emerged in Glasgow. A young woman named Angelica Cluck disappeared. At first, investigators were faced with a single missing person inquiry. As with many cases of this nature, the earliest hours were critical. Police had to establish where Angelica had been, who had seen her, and what circumstances surrounded her disappearance. Angelica was living and working in Glasgow at the time. She had been employed at St. Patrick's Church in Anderston, where she carried out cleaning and other duties. To those familiar with the location, it was an ordinary workplace. A building associated with daily routines, community activity, and religious services. There was nothing immediately obvious to suggest that it would become the center of a major criminal investigation. But as detectives began gathering information, attention turned toward the people who had access to the building. Among those individuals was Peter Tobin. At that stage, Tobin was not an unknown figure. He had a criminal history that included serious offenses, and investigators were aware of his background. However, a criminal record alone does not determine responsibility for a new crime. Detectives still needed evidence connecting him to Angelica's disappearance. The investigation began with the careful collection of information. Who had been inside the church? Who had contact with Angelica? What movements could be established? What evidence existed? Every detail mattered. The early stages of a homicide investigation are often defined by uncertainty. Investigators know that something serious may have happened, but they must work through facts rather than assumptions. They must separate what is known from what is suspected. In Angelica's case, the search quickly became a race against time. Her family and friends wanted answers. Investigators needed to understand what had happened. And every passing hour increased the importance of finding reliable information. As police examined the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, evidence began pointing toward Tobin. The investigation moved from a missing person inquiry into a murder investigation, with Tobin becoming the central suspect. The discovery of Angelica's body inside the church confirmed the worst fears of those searching for her. It also transformed the case. A missing woman had become the victim of a confirmed homicide. For investigators, the focus shifted from finding Angelica to proving how and why she had died. The work became a detailed examination of evidence, witness accounts, forensic findings, and Tobin's movements around the time of her disappearance. The case attracted significant public attention. The location itself contributed to the shock. A place associated with trust and community had become connected with a violent crime. Many people struggled to understand how such an event could happen in a familiar environment. But for detectives, the priority remained the same: building a case based on evidence. Peter Tobin was arrested and later charged in connection with Angelica's murder. As the investigation continued, officers began examining Tobin's wider history. They looked beyond the immediate circumstances of the Glasgow case and started asking questions about his previous movements, previous addresses, and previous interactions with the criminal justice system. This was the moment when the investigation began expanding beyond one victim. The information gathered during the Angelica Cluck investigation would eventually lead detectives toward older cases that had remained unresolved for many years. At first, the connection was not obvious. A murder in Glasgow in 2006. A teenage girl missing from Scotland in 1991. A young woman disappearing from Hampshire in the same year. Different victims. Different locations. Different decades. But the investigation into Peter Tobin created the possibility that these separate tragedies might share a common link. That possibility changed everything. For detectives, the discovery was not simply about uncovering more crimes. It was about revisiting unanswered questions that had remained unresolved for families for years. Every investigation carries responsibility. But investigations involving possible serial offenders carry another layer of complexity. Detectives must examine the possibility of additional victims while remaining focused on evidence. They must consider the past without allowing speculation to replace proof. The case of Angelica Cluck became the doorway into that much larger examination. What began as the search for one missing woman became an investigation into decades of history. The name Peter Tobin would soon become associated not only with one crime, but with a much broader effort to understand whether other lives had been affected by his actions. That effort would become Operation Anagram. And for investigators, the questions had only begun. When Peter Tobin became the focus of the investigation into Angelica Cluck's murder, detectives were faced with a challenge that extended far beyond the immediate crime. They had to understand not only what had happened in Glasgow in 2006, but also who Peter Tobin had been during the decades before that moment. A person's history can often appear ordinary when viewed one piece at a time. A job here. A new address there. A relationship that ended. A town left behind. A fresh beginning somewhere else. But when investigators examine that history after a serious crime, they are not simply looking at events. They are looking for patterns. For Peter Tobin, the investigation revealed a life marked by movement. Over several decades, he had lived in different parts of Scotland and England. He had changed addresses repeatedly. He had entered and exited relationships. He had worked in various occupations. His name appeared in different records across different locations. At first glance, these details described a person who moved frequently. After his conviction, however, investigators had to consider whether those movements had another significance. Were they simply the choices of an unstable individual? Or did they create opportunities for offending to remain hidden? The answer required a careful reconstruction of the past. Detectives began reviewing Tobin's background in detail. They examined where he had lived, where he had worked, and what was known about his activities during different periods of his life. As they built this timeline, one particular period drew renewed attention. The year 1991. 15 years before Angelica Cluck's murder, two young women had disappeared in separate incidents that had remained unresolved for years. Vicky Hamilton was 15 years old when she vanished in Scotland. Dinah McNichol was 18 when she disappeared in Hampshire. For more than a decade, their families had lived without knowing what had happened. Now investigators were asking whether those cases could be connected to the same man. The possibility was both significant and deeply troubling. Cold case investigations often depend on finding connections that were invisible at the time. In 1991, police investigating Vicky's disappearance had no reason to believe a man who would later be arrested in a Glasgow murder case might somehow be connected. The same was true for Dinah's disappearance. The cases existed separately. The connection emerged only after new information changed the way investigators viewed the past. This is one of the most difficult aspects of investigating suspected serial offenders. The evidence often does not appear as a single dramatic revelation. Instead, it develops slowly as investigators compare timelines, locations, and circumstances. The question was not simply whether Tobin had lived near these places. It was whether there was evidence linking him to the disappearances. That distinction became the foundation of the investigation. As detectives examined the possibility of a connection, they looked closely at Tobin's movements around the time Vicky and Dinah disappeared. Where had he been living? Where had he been working? Could witnesses place him in certain locations? Did records support or challenge possible links? The investigation required patience because decades had passed. Buildings had changed. People had moved away. Records were incomplete. Memories had faded. A witness remembering an event from 15 years earlier might recall important details, but investigators had to compare those memories against documentary evidence wherever possible. The passage of time was both an obstacle and an opportunity. It was an obstacle because information was harder to recover. But it was also an opportunity because advances in forensic science allowed investigators to examine evidence that had previously provided no answers. When police searched a property connected to Tobin in Margate, they uncovered evidence that dramatically changed the investigation. The discovery of human remains linked to Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol transformed two missing person cases into homicide investigations. For their families, the discovery brought the end of uncertainty. But it also confirmed the tragedy they had feared. The young women they had spent years hoping to find were no longer missing. They had been victims of murder. For detectives, the discovery was a turning point. Before this moment, Peter Tobin was a convicted murderer connected to one known victim. After this moment, investigators were confronting the possibility that his criminal history extended much further back. The timeline had expanded by 15 years. The investigation had expanded across different regions. And the number of unanswered questions had grown. The discovery also raised a broader question. If Peter Tobin had been responsible for crimes in 1991, could there have been others? This question was not unusual in investigations involving suspected serial offenders. Once a person is linked to multiple crimes separated by time and location, investigators must consider whether other cases deserve examination. However, this process must be approached carefully. A dangerous offender is not automatically responsible for every unsolved crime from the same period. Investigators cannot simply look for cases that match a theory. They must follow evidence. This principle became central to Operation Anagram. The operation was created to examine the possibility of additional victims, but it was never designed to prove a predetermined conclusion. Officers reviewed information with an open mind, knowing that some connections would be meaningful while others would ultimately lead nowhere. Thousands of files were considered. Many possibilities were investigated. Many theories were rejected. That was the reality of the process. For every potential connection, there had to be evidence. The investigation into Tobin's past also brought renewed attention to his earlier criminal behavior. Long before the murders for which he was convicted, Tobin had already demonstrated a history of serious offending. His previous convictions provided investigators with important background information when assessing his behavior and potential risk. But again, detectives had to maintain a careful distinction. A history of violence may explain why someone is considered dangerous. It does not, by itself, prove involvement in unrelated crimes. The evidence connected to Vicky and Dinah had to stand independently. And ultimately, it did. The cases demonstrated the importance of continuing to investigate disappearances even when years have passed. A case that appears impossible to solve may still contain evidence waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right investigative connection. The events surrounding Peter Tobin created a painful realization for many people involved. Somewhere within years of unanswered questions, the truth had existed all along. Vicky's family had spent more than 15 years waiting. Dinah's family had spent more than 15 years searching. Angelica's disappearance had triggered an investigation that reached backward through time and uncovered answers that had seemed impossible. But answers came with a cost. They revealed that the mystery was not one of survival or disappearance. It was a story of violence. And for investigators, that realization created a new responsibility. They had uncovered connections between 3 victims. Now they had to determine whether there were more. That question would become the driving force behind Operation Anagram. A search through decades of records. A review of forgotten cases. An attempt to separate fact from possibility. Because after discovering that Peter Tobin's known crimes stretched back further than anyone expected, detectives had to confront the most difficult question of all. Where did his story really begin? The discovery of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol's remains changed the nature of the investigation forever. Before that moment, Peter Tobin was a convicted murderer whose crime against Angelica Cluck had shocked Scotland. After the discovery in Margate, investigators were forced to look at a much larger and more disturbing possibility. Peter Tobin's known criminal history might not represent the full extent of his actions. The question was no longer only what happened to Angelica Cluck. The question became, how many lives had crossed paths with Peter Tobin during the decades before investigators finally identified him as a murderer? For detectives, this was not a question answered by instinct or fear. It was answered through reconstruction. They had to examine a life that had unfolded across more than 40 years. Every address. Every workplace. Every period of time where his movements could be established. Every location where a person connected to an unresolved case might have encountered him. The scale of the task was enormous. A single homicide investigation can involve thousands of pieces of information. Operation Anagram required investigators to examine a suspected offender's entire documented history across multiple police areas and multiple decades. The challenge was not only finding information. It was deciding what information mattered. When detectives examine possible serial offending, they often look for repeated patterns. Victim characteristics. Geographical behavior. Methods of approach. Periods of activity. Changes in lifestyle. These patterns can sometimes reveal connections between crimes that initially appear unrelated. However, real investigations are rarely simple. Human behavior does not always follow a predictable formula. An offender may change locations. A victim may not fit previous patterns. Evidence may be missing. A crime may remain hidden for years before anyone understands its significance. For Operation Anagram, investigators approached the past with caution. They were aware that Peter Tobin's confirmed crimes involved young women, but they could not assume every missing woman from the same period was connected to him. The investigation had to remain focused on evidence. That meant examining possibilities while accepting that many would not lead to conclusions. One of the most significant challenges was the passage of time. Decades can transform a crime scene beyond recognition. A building may be demolished. A road may be redesigned. A neighborhood may change completely. People who once lived nearby may have moved away or passed on. Records that seemed unimportant at the time may become difficult to locate. Even memories become complicated. A person who witnessed something unusual 20 or 30 years earlier may remember the general impression but not the exact details. Investigators must carefully evaluate such information, understanding both its potential value and its limitations. The passage of time creates uncertainty. But it does not erase the possibility of truth. This belief drove Operation Anagram. As the investigation expanded, police examined numerous unresolved cases and compared them against Tobin's known history. The process involved reviewing missing person reports, historical investigations, and information from different police forces. Some cases appeared worth examining because of similarities. Perhaps Tobin had lived nearby. Perhaps the timing overlapped. Perhaps there was a connection between locations. But many possible links ended there. A coincidence. Nothing more. This was one of the most important realities of the operation. A suspect can appear connected to many events simply because they lived a long life across many places. The longer someone's history, the more coincidences investigators will naturally find. The responsibility of detectives was to determine which connections were meaningful. The public attention surrounding Operation Anagram created another challenge. Outside the investigation, speculation grew rapidly. The idea that Peter Tobin might have been responsible for numerous additional crimes captured public imagination. The possibility of an unidentified serial killer operating for decades created fear and fascination. But investigators worked differently. They could not build cases based on public belief. They could not treat rumors as evidence. They could not allow pressure for answers to influence the standards required for justice. Every possible victim deserved more than speculation. Every family deserved the truth, not assumptions. This approach sometimes meant disappointing conclusions. A case might be investigated extensively and still remain unresolved. A theory might appear convincing but fail to meet the legal standard required for prosecution. For detectives, accepting uncertainty was part of the job. The investigation also brought attention to another long-standing mystery, the identity of the offender known as Bible John. The murders attributed to Bible John had remained one of Scotland's most famous unsolved cases since the late 1960s. Because Peter Tobin had lived in Glasgow during that era, some people questioned whether he might have been responsible. The possibility was examined. Investigators considered the available information, compared timelines, and reviewed similarities and differences. But despite public interest and speculation, no evidence emerged that could conclusively identify Tobin as Bible John. The theory remained unproven. This was a recurring theme throughout Operation Anagram. Possibility was everywhere. Proof was much harder to find. The deeper investigators looked into Peter Tobin's past, the more they encountered the same difficult reality. They were examining not only crimes. They were examining lost opportunities. Questions about whether earlier warning signs had been recognized. Questions about whether information had been shared effectively. Questions about how someone with a known history of serious offending continued moving through communities. These questions were uncomfortable but important. Every major criminal investigation creates an opportunity to understand how future cases might be handled differently. Operation Anagram became more than a search for additional victims. It became an examination of how a dangerous offender could remain hidden for so long. Despite the uncertainty surrounding possible additional crimes, 3 victims remained at the center of what investigators could prove. Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, Dinah McNichol. Their cases represented the evidence-based foundation of the investigation. 3 women. 3 families. 3 stories connected through a man whose criminal history had taken years to fully uncover. For their families, the investigation brought answers that had been impossible for years. But for investigators, those answers created new questions. Because when a person responsible for multiple murders is finally identified, there is always a possibility that other victims remain unknown. That possibility is what drove Operation Anagram forward. Not certainty. Not assumption. But responsibility. The responsibility to look deeper. To examine every reasonable possibility. To search for those who might otherwise remain forgotten. And to ensure that if another victim existed, their story would not disappear into the silence of history. The investigation had moved beyond one crime scene, beyond one city, and beyond one year. It had become a journey through decades of unanswered questions. A search through the hidden chapters of Peter Tobin's life. And the further detectives looked, the more they realized that the greatest mystery was no longer what he had done. It was how much remained unknown. The most significant turning point in the investigation into Peter Tobin did not come from a dramatic confession. It did not come from a witness suddenly remembering a crucial detail. It came from a place that, for years, had appeared completely ordinary. A garden. A piece of ground behind a house in Margate. A place where seasons had changed, where rain had fallen, where plants had grown, and where daily life had continued above secrets hidden beneath the surface. When investigators first began searching the property connected to Peter Tobin after his arrest for the murder of Angelica Cluck, they were looking for evidence related to one crime. They were not expecting to uncover a connection to two missing person cases that had haunted families for more than 15 years. But that is exactly what happened. The discovery would transform the entire investigation. It would change how police viewed Peter Tobin. It would lead to the creation of one of the most extensive reviews of a suspected serial offender ever conducted in Britain. And it would finally provide answers to families who had spent years living with uncertainty. The property in Margate had become a focus of investigators because of Tobin's connection to it. At the time, police were already aware that Tobin's background required careful examination. His history of serious offending meant that detectives could not approach the case as a simple isolated incident. They had to consider the possibility that there might be more evidence connected to his past. This is a common challenge in major investigations. A crime scene is not always limited to the location where a victim is found. Sometimes, answers exist somewhere else. A previous address. A forgotten storage area. A place connected to the suspect years earlier. Investigators therefore examined locations associated with Tobin's history, searching for information that could clarify what had happened and whether his known crimes extended beyond Angelica Cluck's murder. The Margate property became one of those locations. At first, it was simply another place connected to the suspect. Then the ground revealed something that nobody expected. Human remains were discovered. The significance of that moment was immediate. A search connected to one murder investigation had uncovered evidence of another tragedy. The investigation had suddenly expanded across time. For detectives, discovering human remains is never simply about identifying a body. It is about restoring a story. A set of remains represents someone who had a life before they became evidence. Someone had once waited for them to come home. Someone had searched for them. Someone had kept photographs. Someone had wondered, year after year, what had happened. The discovery created a connection between the property and two long unsolved disappearances. The remains were later identified as belonging to Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. For their families, the news brought a painful kind of certainty. After years of searching, after years of unanswered questions, they finally knew what had happened. But the truth was devastating. The disappearance of a loved one carries uncertainty. A family may imagine countless possibilities. A person may have left voluntarily. A person may have lost contact. A person may still return. The discovery of remains removes that uncertainty forever. It provides answers. But those answers can be unbearable. The discovery also forced investigators to reconsider the timeline of Peter Tobin's offending. Before this point, the focus had been on events surrounding Angelica Cluck's disappearance in 2006. Now, detectives were looking back 15 years earlier. The investigation had moved from a single crime to a possible pattern. This was the moment when the idea of Operation Anagram began to take shape. The question facing police was enormous. If Peter Tobin was responsible for murders in 1991 and 2006, could there be other victims? To answer that question, investigators needed to understand his entire history. Not just the years surrounding the known murders. His entire adult life. The search of the Margate property also demonstrated